Our second panel for the day is on governance. So governance systems today are facing a dual challenge, responding to the accelerating impacts of the climate crisis, while also addressing the erosion of communication, trust, and shared understanding that collective action depends upon. This session will examine how governance systems, both formal and informal, local and global, are adapting to these pressures, what innovations are emerging, and where the limits are showing. So I'm really glad that this panel will be moderated by Jennifer Winter. She's a professor at the University of Calgary and also on an interchange as a departmental science advisor with Environment and Climate Change Canada. The panelists are Catherine Abreu, the director, who just made it in time, that's great, the director of International Climate Politics Hub, and has been sending out great regular information as we prepare for the Conference of Parties in Brazil in November. Virtually, I'm hoping we have Nicholas Diamond, is that correct? So welcome, Nicholas, who's the lead for Behavioural and Data Science with Impact Canada. Zoe Grams is the executive director for the Climate Caucus, and Chris Tenove is the assistant director at the Centre for the Study of Democratic Institutions at the University of British Columbia. And so, Jennifer, we're in your good hands, Jennifer Winter, to moderate this discussion.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and to moderate this panel and have this discussion. And we're going to keep it quite conversational. I have some questions prepared, and then about maybe halfway through, we'll turn it back to you to ask us questions. And I think, so to start off with, we really want to dig into what are the roles of different levels of government in addressing climate change. So like the sort of the fundamentals of how these orders of government are interacting, what they're doing, and the mechanisms they use. And then a follow-up to that is, how are these governance systems, local, national, global, coping with the combined pressures of accelerating climate disruption and these fractured information environments that we've been talking about this morning? So I think, Kat, I'll start with you.
Thanks so much for having me. Really great to be here. And as we were preparing for this session, we got on the call, we were like, climate governance. And at some point I was like, do we all have like a shared definition of what we mean when we're using this phrase climate governance? So I thought it might be useful just to frame that up and to give you a little bit of my sense of what climate governance frameworks look like right now, and then segue that into how those governance frameworks are trying to tackle climate myths and disinformation. So when I think about climate governance, I think about the frameworks, the institutions, the regulatory and policy prescriptions that exist at various orders of government, from international through domestic through local, that help bring a timeline and consistency to government and other actors' actions on climate change, that bring that timeline and consistency to the reporting and the communication around what those actors and governments are doing on climate change, and that have some form of accountability mechanism built into it, whether that's a legal consequence for not fulfilling the commitments, requirement to go back to the drawing board and rejig the plans, etc. Very loose sketch of my vision of what governance systems look like these days when it comes to climate. So there's a bit of a myth that there isn't a governance or legal framework at the international level. In fact, there is. The Paris Agreement is legally binding in that it does legally bind states who are signatories to the Paris Agreement to hold to the temperature limit of well below 2 degrees. And wrapped up in that, there's a whole bunch of reporting and transparency mechanisms that all signatories, so basically every country in the world, have to do every year on climate. And increasingly we're seeing in those reports, when countries come to the UN climate talks, that they are talking about climate and disinformation and the struggles that countries are having wading through the increasing pressures from the ways in which the public discourse is being manipulated in order to actually deliver on the policies that are necessary. Increasingly, we are also seeing a norm of countries developing their own climate governance systems. Often that's taken in the form of climate laws that then, develop this process of, okay, when are you doing your climate plans? How are you reporting on them? What happens if you miss your target? Canada's law was passed a number of years ago in 2021, our first comprehensive climate law. And, maybe talk to me after the break about how our climate governance system is working right now. And then, of course, we've got subnational, I know Zoe will be talking to this, actors who also have their own kind of climate governance framework. So it's a really kind of complex environment where these governance systems are locking into each other. And I would say, as is the case with all governance systems, it takes some time for them to kind of catch up with what's happening in the real world. So it has been taking those governance systems some time to catch up with the stark reality of this rise in climate mis and disinformation. And just this year has the international space introduced this global initiative for information integrity on climate that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That was launched a number of months ago by the UN, UNESCO, and Brazil, who's the host of this year's climate talks. Forgive me if you've already heard this morning, who the country members of that initiative are so far: Chile, Denmark, France, Morocco, Sweden, UK, Uruguay. I think there are a couple of people in this room who are trying to get Canada on board. And we've got a number of UN entities in there as well. So it's an interesting space that's just emerging, and it's shaping up for this set of UN climate talks to be a pretty breakthrough year in terms of the international system kind of sending that signal back into domestic and subnational governance systems that this is something that we need to be responding to. It also contemplates the development of a dedicated fund to be dealing with this. Funds are having a hard time these days because a certain major donor has been pulling all their money out of all the funds. But that is kind of the landscape right now that we're looking at.
Thanks, Kat. That was a great introduction. Zoe, you want to speak to more of the local aspect?
Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be in the room with you all today, and I'm glad we're having these conversations. So the role of local government when it comes to climate governance, I think, cannot be underestimated. In Canada, local governments are responsible for almost half of all of our country's emissions. So directly, that's based on what local governments own, and indirectly, it's based around how their policies are affecting how we use transportation, how we use our buildings, and other essential infrastructure pieces. And speaking of infrastructure, local government also owns more than 60% of our infrastructure. So roads, bridges, wastewater, waste, transportation, et cetera. So the potential that at scale local governments have to impact our collective emissions and what collectively we're doing around climate is really significant. And of course, it goes without saying, I think, that local governments are on the front lines of the climate impacts that we're seeing more and more around the world and in our communities coast to coast to coast. Through the campaign Elbows Up for Climate, next week we're going to be releasing some information about how many communities have been affected by climate impacts this summer. And it's very, very sobering. Last week, I was on a call with a number of different mayors from across the country, and and the realities that they're facing just keep coming. You know, one person's talking about $140 million of damage that their community is experiencing. Two mayors were talking about how their communities have been in drought for the last 5 years. One mayor was wearing an N95 mask in his office because it was not safe for him to breathe the air without it. So these consequences are here, they're with us, and ultimately local governments are often on the front lines of dealing with that. What does it look like to adapt our communities as these challenges are going to only increase? What does it look like to find the funding and the financial mechanisms for us to adapt that? And what does it look like to keep our communities safe and to have those conversations with community members? And all of that, I think, not only speaks to the larger climate consequences, but also how government and local government is contributing to what the culture of governance is in this country and what citizens can expect from their government in terms of keeping us safe and in terms of building our community. I could talk a lot, and I think we're going to talk a bit about the challenges that that local governments are facing a little bit later on. So I won't speak too much on that right now. But you know, to answer the question, how are local governments coping with these dual crises of mis and disinformation and the climate crisis? The answer is stoically. You know, it's incredibly difficult. Resources are already very tight, and we're seeing the combined challenges of both of these things play out in our communities in a very, very serious way. And looking forward to diving in a little bit more to that.
Thanks, Zoe. That was that was great. And we will we're going to dig into these sort of like challenges in intergovernmental relations in a little bit. But first, I'll let Chris give his thoughts on the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, this the theme that we're addressing today really reminds me of the fact that some of the challenges or even in the physical environment are very much what we see in the information environment as well. So we've got increasing unpredictability and weirdness, too much influence by very powerful and wealthy individuals and companies, way too much hot air. And so just as we need to think about, you know, physical system governance, we need to think about information system governance. And so I'm very much picking up some of the threads that we started talking about in the first session today. And just to give a sense of what we might mean by information governance, I thought it would be helpful to think about the different ways in which governance, including governance by private actors, might be playing a role during an episode of climate disinformation. So imagine that there is an activist who opposes climate action and wants to use wildfire breaking out as an event in order to drive that message. A place they could start is by creating fake drone video of a wildfire starting, with figures emerging from the forest, perhaps fake audio of a climate activist saying that they had started the fire. And I'd note in BC and I think other places, we had a lot of examples this summer of synthetic images of wildfires circulating at the same time that we were having real wildfires, and the wildfire BC Wildfire Services had to manage communication around that. So they can go to models to create this kind of material. What are the checks there on creating it? You know, there are some terms of service by OpenAI and others about what can be created, but there are ways to kind of break or get around their rules, or one can use like an open source model in order to create this material. At the moment, we don't have a reliable way to watermark synthetic material to make it easier so that downstream people can identify it as created and manipulated. So some real challenges there. And then there's, of course, all the issues around emissions from data centers in the AI industry, which is a whole other topic. So then the individual wants to get it out to an audience to have some influence. And there we run into some of the problems with social media platforms that Sonia in particular was talking about last session, having to do with not just that the retrenchment, the backing off of earlier efforts to have fact-checking systems, often failures to enforce their own rules in terms of service around content that's being shared. And so not as many safeguards there to prevent misleading information from spreading. And then, maybe that individual doesn't have a big audience. So what you need is to get this promoted by a prominent account or an influencer on social media platforms. And that's a whole other area that is underregulated at the moment. And both in terms of the part that the Competition Act can handle, which has to do with when right now it's more narrowly focused on when an individual is marketing a service or a product, and there's some real requirements there. But if it's around more a social issue or political issue, it's a lot there's a lot less regulation in place. And so there's some big questions then about, how do we follow the money and understand why certain voices are so prominent and so effective at getting messages out. And then also, do we need more of professional ethics or something? I mean, we do see big picture changes in our information system of increasing gatekeeping or amplification roles by influencers compared to more traditional journalism outlets. And so journalism developed a set of ethics and professional commitments that give us some sense of how they will address difficult issues, and much more needs to be done there in the influencer sector. So these are all some ways in which we need to think about these broader information system and how to give it some more guidance.
Thanks, that was really interesting. Sorry, Zoe and Kat, your interventions were also really interesting. Whoops. What the thing a moderator is not supposed to do. Nick, let's bring you into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I hope you can all hear me. I can't see you, but you can see me. I understand I'm floating somewhere above the stage, like the Wizard of Oz or something. So I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. But thank you for tolerating me here on the screen. So first of all, I'm coming to you from the Privy Council office. I work on a behavioral science team in PCO. That's been doing a lot of really massive national scale surveying and data science on Canadians' experiences of, climate policy, but also more broadly, I'll be speaking to you about a study we've been running for a few years now called the Trust, Information, and Digital Ecosystem Study, which is trying to understand stressors on trust in government and public policy in the climate space, but also across multiple policy issues, climate, health, immigration, especially. And so in response to this first question, the key message I have to share is that, based on my work and my team's work to date, I think that stressors on federal level climate policy making and communication are really massively impacted by many upstream factors that are well upstream of the climate issue per se. This is, I think, not surprising to anybody in the room. The problems of trust and mis and disinformation, foreign adversarial influence, and platform effects are all much bigger than climate per se. But for now, I want to just maybe build on Chris's point and just speak to the issue of fractured information environments in the country and how this affects the sort of federal level governance problem, especially when it comes to communication. So first of all, we've been seeing for years now that there is not one Canada to govern. There is no average Canadian. There are sort of multiple Canadas. And I think at this point, 2025, where people live in information space is as or more important than where they live in physical space. Concretely, using a lot of massive data sets, and some machine learning, we're able to see, to break down the population into different information bubbles in which folks live. We consistently find that there are sort of three non-overlapping bubbles. You've got like low news consumers, generally speaking, the lowest consumers of all information, except for like influencers and social media, where they're sort of in the middle. You've got your traditional sort of mainstream news consumers, and then you've got your really social media dominated news consumers. What we find is that these three groups of Canadians, which span regional and demographic differences, have extremely different responses to climate misinformation, climate policy, living in very different realities about what is happening or not in the world. We can also break things down further by social media platforms. So this was alluded to this morning, but we have some interesting sort of Canadian citizens' eye view data on social media platforms. I'll just give you one tidbit. We've been looking at the relationship between the amount of time that Canadians spend on different social media platforms by their own report and their responses to climate mis and disinformation claims. And we've seen that time spent on different platforms, another marginal unit of more time spent, is linked to very different changes in belief in climate mis and disinformation. Twitter/X is the most interesting platform, which used to be linked to more resistance against climate misinformation and then swung heavily to the other side in late 2022. Make of that timing what you will, where now time spent on Twitter/X is the most linked to greater susceptibility to climate mis and disinformation. So that was a sort of big real-time change in public discourse that we were able to see. So to boil this all down, the key point, I think, is at the federal level when it comes to setting climate policy and communicating, we need to find a way to pierce through this sort of fractured information environment, find a way to not just preach to the converted, so to speak, and find a way to like better earn trust and attention in this competitive information economy.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate that. I want just to dig in a little bit more into this issue on like pressures of trust in government and institutions, like both in general and specific to climate change, and particularly the role of declining trust in science and scientific authority in these changes. And I'm also struck by a lot of your comments, and so far have been around the theme of the sort of like decentralized responsibility in that, like, climate change is a collective action problem, and part of the sort of the microcosm of that collective action problem is that decentralized responsibility and shared responsibility between, like in Canada, federal governments, provinces and territories, local governments, communities, and then that, the added layer of Canada's role in the international space and interacting. So maybe, Nick, can you expand a little bit on your work on declining trust and public opinion and sorry, not enough coffee. Anyway, the floor is yours, Nick.
Yes, declining trust. So trust matters for public policy effectiveness. We've seen this over and over again. The degree to which people trust not just the federal government, but all sorts of public institutions in general and on specific issues is, we think, sort of massively linked to their actual behavior in the world, their uptake or rejection of public policy, so on and so forth. So I want to give you maybe one evocative example. So as I mentioned, we've been measuring trust in the government and different institutions across policy areas for a few years. I want to give you one quick example from public health, which I know is a somewhat different topic, but I think it's compelling. So as we all know, there's a massive historically successful vaccine rollout during COVID, successful by historical standards. Yet in Canada, from before COVID to now, more people lost confidence in vaccines than gained confidence in vaccines. And a huge swath of the population saw a significant decrease in their vaccine confidence. And worse yet, unfortunately, we know that trust in the government's ability to be effective on climate change, broadly speaking, is even lower than trust in the government on public health. So there's a lot of distrust in the government to effectively respond to climate change and to be a communicator about climate change. As I mentioned before, I think the stressors on trust, on this trust, some may be climate specific, but I think a lot of it boils down to sort of big picture stressors that we all know about. So there's mis and disinformation, there's foreign adversarial influence, there's a rise of anti-elite, anti-establishment sentiment. And we could sort of talk about all these stressors in turn, but I want to close by flipping the question around a little bit. So we can talk about decline in trust and also, belief in misinformation as causes of friction in, effective climate policy or in combating climate change, but they're also consequences. I think ultimately it will not work to sort of point to declining trust and to misinformation as the bad guys here per se. I think all institutions, all governments need to look inward at the ways that trust is being earned or failing to be earned in this sort of new trust and information landscape in which we live. And so, I think we need to think about ways that institutions, governments, civil society, whatever, can pivot to better earn trust by changing our own behaviors and not just sort of focusing on the behaviors of citizens or malicious actors.
Thank you. Very insightful. Zoe, would you like to comment on what the issues around trust look like at the local level?
Hello. Great. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So I'm going to give a few on-the-ground examples of how some of these themes that Nicholas has spoken to and which we've heard in previous panels, how they're really playing out at a local governance level. And then I'd love to zoom out and talk about some other factors that I think are further amplifying that. So the first thing that we're really seeing, of course, is a mistrust in institutions. And there's a few ways that's playing out in councils. The first is that there are growing conspiracy theories about how the UN controls our local governments, that essentially there is a kind of intra-government cabal, and that there are shadowy forces which are demanding that local governments make decisions that support the elites rather than their community members. And that is gaining steam. There's actually been a number of councils who have put forward motions to renege from the Partners of Climate Protection, which is a way that municipalities can measure their emissions and also actually gain access to a lot of funding, which is useful for communities. So we're seeing this not just online, but really play out in some of our council meetings. We're also seeing a lot of heightened rhetoric in council meetings. And when I say we, I should say that I work with mayors and councillors across the country. And so it's those people that I'm hearing these things from. And even people who are speaking in council meetings are saying things like, "You're not letting me speak," or you're trampling on my right to free speech. So I think it's both interesting and distressing that even at a local governance level, where you are the closest you can be to kind of working democracy, I would say, there is still such a deep distrust amongst certain members of the population that they don't feel heard even in those climates. And then we're also seeing a lot of mistrust about climate policy. And this isn't necessarily coming from people who are denying the importance of climate policy, but I think there's a growing sense that the climate policy decisions that are being made are being done so based on an ideological basis rather than what is actually going to support community needs. And so the co-benefits and the long-term benefits of how these different policies are going to support communities are often underreported or underserved. And so I think that leads to, again, growing distrust of the particular policy and how it's going to be enacted, but again, also of the institution. And finally, without wanting to take too long, I do just really want us to zoom out on other factors that are accelerating this. Misogyny is on the rise, and there are fewer women who are rerunning for local council because of this. We don't have any longitudinal studies, but anecdotally, we're certainly finding this. We know that there's more acceptability to be hateful and to critique the people that you disagree with. We know that sort of the currency of truth has significantly gone down, so the normalization of not needing to tell the truth is way up. And we've also, I think, become, if not immune to, then certainly are not feeling the hugely significant effects of the complete decimation of local news in the country. So we're also getting really normalized to not really having a pillar of what's kind of objectively truthful or where we can turn. So all of these things together, the misogyny, the polarization, the lack of a healthy news environment, those things are eroding our local communities in a way that then mis and disinformation, especially about climate, can really sink in further. And the final thing I'll say is that this is the issue that the mayors and councillors that we work with are most concerned about. So this and funding is what keeps them up at night.
Okay. Thank you. That was a little bit scary. Yeah. Yeah. Chris, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. And this is very much building on what Zoe has just said. Our team at the Center for Study of Democratic Institutions has been doing some work on how local governments are experiencing and responding to climate mis and disinformation, but also the broader challenges around having good public conversations on climate policies. And it's on our website if anyone wants to look it up. So take a look at the website for the Center for Study of Democratic Institutions. As part of that, we did some analyses of the social media posts around a few controversies in local government climate policy. And one of them was on the 15-minute cities policy, or 15-minute communities policy in Edmonton, which you probably have heard something about this. It made a fair amount of news. So the idea is there's a kind of global template for policies to design cities so that there is easier for people to access essential services by walking, biking, et cetera, within 15 minutes rather than having to drive. And it's like appealing across many groups and broadly hard to argue with. Of course, the way it gets implemented matters a lot. Edmonton was following this blueprint in the development of its new city planning approach. This was it began in 2021, but in 2023 to 2024, there was suddenly a lot of quite hostile narratives to it. And I should add that this is something that's happened outside of Canada and earlier, particularly in the UK, a kind of backlash to this idea of 15-minute communities. And what we saw in the Edmonton case was that, especially looking at the online sphere, the platform sphere, we could see some of these narratives that had been deployed in other contexts quickly filter into the Edmonton public discourse on platforms, both by national, internet, and international influencers commenting on it, and by more local voices taking it up, and merging with some of the more provincial-based political movements that are critical of action on climate. And so this was happening online. We could see that there's like an influencer effect there. But what does that look like for council and for the city staff? So some of the things they experienced were some local in-person protests some pretty contentious and difficult council meetings where they're trying to review this and dealing with these things like people coming in and being quite antagonistic. But also we've been doing some interviews with people who are elected in cities or communication staff. But in the Edmonton example in particular, a few people mentioned, for instance, an individual, an elderly man who came up to speak to council and said, I'm very scared about this policy. I'm not going to be able to pay to leave my district to visit family across town. And so, there's kind of smaller populations that are both mobilized and vulnerable to these mis and disinformation efforts. And another thing we learned from the Edmonton case, I think, and in speaking to people directly involved, is that they didn't really see this one coming. It seemed such a benign policy. And a few folks in different cities have commented saying, we don't really know quite what the issue is going to be that's going to provoke a more dramatic reaction and something that might be hard to manage. In terms of getting the truth out or even addressing issues around the hostility or even abuse that counselors and staff might face. And so part of it is, maybe better warning systems are important, but I think another part is there can be these like sudden storms or flare-ups of online attention that local governments are buffeted by. And there are ways in which I think Edmonton was pretty resilient to this in this case, which maybe I can get into later.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I promise the depressing section will be over soon. Kat's going to talk about anti-climate forces, and then we're going to get into like the toolkit and hopefully that governments have at their disposal a little more uplifting and proactive and hopeful.
Well, I can't promise not to be depressing, but I can hope to fire you up because it's time to talk about who's behind all of this. And I think it's really useful to refer to a comprehensive study that was conducted earlier this year and published by the International Panel on the Information Environment, where they assessed 300 independent studies on climate information. And it was their goal to identify who is producing climate misinformation, how are they propagating it, and what are the impacts that climate misinformation is having. Their ultimate finding is that climate misinformation is turning this crisis into catastrophe, which was pretty stark words from a UN mandated international research body. Who do you think was the #1 culprit they found? Fossil fuels, right? Who benefits the most from eroding the public trust in government to act on climate change? In this report, the researchers clearly say that the fossil fuel industry has engaged in a dual deception. First, they denied the existence of climate change. They denied their own science, as we all know, on climate change. Then they started greenwashing themselves to displace our understanding of where the responsibility for climate change should rest. And now they are engaged in comprehensive delay and distraction tactics, making very good use of climate mis and disinformation. I've worked over the course of my career from the local to the provincial to the national to the international levels, and it's really interesting to see when you're working across those various spheres, the playbook that the fossil fuel industry has that plays out consistently in various parts of the world. So this playbook of deny, delay, distract is seen not just here in Canada, but in many other countries. So recently there was a blackout in Spain. We saw a huge inundation of mis and disinformation to convince people that the reason for that blackout was the high penetration of renewable energy in the Spanish and Portuguese energy grids. And of course, it was not the renewable energy that shut the grid down. It was a lag in investment in modernizing the energy grids across those two countries, a lag that, again, most countries are experiencing because, again, often the fossil fuel industry stands in the way of the modernization of those systems, which is necessary for the integration of renewable energy. But this kind of evolution of climate denialism into campaigns that are focused on discrediting solutions is something that we see again and again over the course of events across the planet. And this is such an extreme situation at this point that when this report came out, the UN Human Rights Rapporteur called for misinformation and greenwashing by the fossil fuel industry to be criminalized. This is not a climate activist. This is a human rights UN rapporteur who is calling out the actions of the fossil fuel industry as being criminal for the human species. And she also said that it's necessary for us to defossilize information systems after decades of the fossil fuel industry flooding those information systems with their own misinformation. Of course, the fossil fuel industry has buddies. There are some good friends that also engage in spreading these lies and who are a part of developing this playbook that we see, again, quite consistently play out around the world. The US electricity companies tend to be pretty bad actors in that space. So this, this attempt to really paint renewables as, unreliable, as problematic, as too expensive, that has been a very consistent effort of the fossil fuel industry in league with US electricity companies. Animal agriculture, airlines, automobile, tourism, and fast food industries were also found in this report to be some of the bad actors. And I think really important to also talk about the significant political figures who are now in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. I was raging when Trump was elected and everyone was talking about how much Elon Musk funded his campaign and not talking about the orders of magnitude larger of funding that the Trump campaign received directly from fossil fuels. He is a puppet of the fossil fuel industry. And increasingly, the fossil fuel industry and big tech are in this unholy alliance using the same playbook of mis and disinformation to get their way in the world. The report also found that alliances of industry and conservative think tanks again, are developing this playbook and propagating it in various cultural environments in different parts of the global community. And Russia, of course, plays a significant role here. In particular, trolling farms in Russia are increasingly targeting not just the public. So, we heard from Chris and Zoe the ways in which and Nicholas, of course, the ways in which the public are being susceptible to climate mis and disinformation. But increasingly, these troll farms are targeting political leaders, civil servants, and regulatory agencies. So they're specifically going after the people who are supposed to be making these decisions based on the best information and science that's available. I think it's critical that we name the culprit every time we talk about climate inaction and the barriers that we are facing to taking action on this crisis. And every single time, it's going to be the fossil fuel industry.
Okay, this is a great, fascinating conversation. Reminder to be thinking about your questions for the panel. Let's turn to solutions. I think, like Kat, you alluded to one is like naming bad actors. What responses do governments have in their toolkits, and like how effective are these? Who wants to jump in? Chris? Yeah.
Sure. I'm happy, in part because I started this story about 15-minute cities, and I'm sure people are on the edge of their seats about what happened. So maybe I can finish that up and mention a few things I learned from it. And I don't think I was really clear about the types of narratives that had to do with the pushback against the planning. And they were ones that were very familiar to what Zoe was mentioning. So a lot of these were fears about a great reset, loss of civil liberties, globalist forces driving city policies, and these sorts of things, along with concerns about I'm not being able to drive vehicles, and so they're hard to handle, but they're not necessarily believed by a large number of people. So I think Edmonton was fairly resilient to the issue, despite the fact that there was a lot of this heat online. One thing they had going for them is there wasn't a real division on the city council itself around these things. And as Zoe could, I'm sure, say, it's things become a lot more difficult when there's a representative of especially these more conspiracist views on council. And more broadly, like, political leadership on these issues is so important, and it's one of the reasons why the Climate Caucus is such a great thing that we've got going. So there wasn't the division on city council. There was also a lot of groundwork that City of Edmonton had done. They were quite transparent about the development of the policy going back years. They held open houses. If people were good faith about this, they could very clearly see that this wasn't a hidden policy development, that there had been real efforts to consult people and consider how it will affect them. So they had that track record going for them. And I think a big part of what their response was thinking about, okay, there are maybe some people who are not going to be able to get to and persuade that this is the right policy, but let's think about the broader public and also about more specific groups that really matter. And so I think as a general kind of approach on responses to some of these sorts of informational challenges, I think figuring out who are the audiences that you need to engage and through what channels are appropriate. And I think sometimes that is going to be not decamping from the platforms, but actually occupying them or finding voices that can really get to these issues on TikTok, on X even, so that they're not entirely devoid of different points of view on some of these issues. But more broadly, it can be like rallying key business sectors to say, for instance, like, no, this, thinking of different policies, no, this isn't going to lead to major increases in the cost of development of new buildings, say policies around the requirement not to have gas heating in homes. So this policy is not going to tank our efforts to increase accessibility of housing, and it really matters if it's coming from those people who are building homes. So finding those audiences and mobilizing the coalitions that really matter, I think is very key to effective responses.
Great, thanks, Chris. Nick, I know you wanted to jump in on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I'll say quickly, I'm of course just giving my own 2 cents here and not speaking on behalf of the government. But building on the earlier points, I do think when we think about toolkits and actions and responses here, of course, we do need to find evidence-based, effective ways to combat mis and disinformation, to address these stressors, these upstream stressors in the information environment. That's true, but I'll turn again to the flip side of the equation and maybe think about like the demand side of the misinformation problem. So why is there demand for mis and disinformation? Why is there distrust in institutions? And what can governments do about that to better earn trust? I think, first of all, we've been trying to build up a toolkit, or at least a framework for how governments can design for trust. Like, what are the levers, or I should say governments, institutions, organizations, anybody interfacing with the public and trying to create some, change in relation to climate change. So I think we need to think about measurable ways that we can redesign to demonstrate competence, like being able to actually solve the problem, care about people, and integrity or transparency. And I want to offer one quick description of one particular tool or idea we tested out that's really in the communication space, which is the idea of operational transparency. So I think when it comes to issues of scientific misinformation, like climate change, like the scientists, like us in the room, you in the room, have an advantage because science, we have evidence. We're not looking for blind trust. We shouldn't be asking people to blindly trust science or governments or chastise people for not trusting. I think one way to earn trust is with transparency. So this was another example from the public health space, but I think it applies broadly to climate. During COVID, we looked at the government's actual status quo Twitter message campaign trying to increase vaccine uptake. I think a lot of people were feeling that there was like an unreachable segment of the population which rejected the science or rejected vaccines. We ran an experiment with a few thousand unvaccinated Canadians. This was a couple years into COVID, so presumably intentionally unvaccinated. And we compared to that status quo message campaign, alternative Twitter message campaigns, leveraging different ways of operationalizing this idea of operational transparency, which is basically just giving people a reason to trust. So a more like glass walls approach to public policy. One version was showing people, all the different vaccines that were tested, how we arrived at the final few. Here was the process. Another one was, clearly unpacking the benefits and the risks. So rather than simply asserting the benefits outweigh the risks, go get vaccinated, just laying out, here's the data, here's the benefits, here's the risks. And we found that among a few thousand unvaccinated Canadians, has actually measurably increased vaccine intentions by about 9%, which maybe doesn't feel huge, but would make a big difference at scale if that generalized. So by analogy, in climate policy, I think we need to think about ways to sort of, once again, compete for trust and compete for attention and give people a reason to buy in and to trust institutions rather than simply telling them to. We need to find a way to sort of compete with the bad actors. And the evidence is on our side. So we should leverage that evidence.
Thanks, Nick. That was a great example. And I have on my note pages, I've starred that we shouldn't be looking for blind trust in science. I think that's really important. Zoe, Kat, do you want to get in on this?
And I'll echo much of what my fellow panelists have been saying, and actually it ties into a lot of what was shared in the last session too. After maybe sharing some very depressing statistics, I'm at risk of sounding almost Pollyanna-ish in what I'm about to say, but while mis and disinformation is a huge technological problem, and while it's a huge problem in terms of governance, and while we need a lot of regulation to help counter that, it's also a very, very human problem. And I think that local governments have a huge opportunity and role to play in this human side of it. When we really think about why people are in part drawn to these ideas, I just will forever go back to Arlie Hochschild and her conception of deep story. Like, it doesn't necessarily matter if the facts are right, it matters if it feels right. And so local government is where we can start to address these feelings about our position in society and our position in our communities and what kind of agency we have. So I think there's just a really huge amount of potential, not only for municipal policy, but for us to be thinking about local government as the foundational piece for some of these larger moves over time. Things that local governments can do, I mean, further civic engagement is absolutely essential. What does it look like to have more citizen assemblies? What does it look like to have ways of engaging with different groups of people, including outside of more formal forums like councils? And really thinking partly building on what Chris is saying, thinking about sort of who are the not usual suspects, but who are community leaders who we need to engage with, who we need to think about bringing into the room, and building long-term relationships. So we're not just going to them a month before there's going to be a motion, but really thinking about what their input looks like, not only so that they can help to counter mis and disinformation in communities, but so that they can also be really honest about what their community members are feeling and facing, so that local government can be really responsive. Accountability and transparency, as Nicholas was saying, I think there's a lot that can be done there. And I also really think that there's more that can be done around pooling our resources. So to my knowledge, and I think your research backs this up, because there aren't many, if any, local governments who have official mis and disinformation policies. It's incredibly difficult, especially for small and mid-sized municipalities, to have the resources to deal with communications on a day-to-day basis. So when you're flooded with misinformation, or when you're dealing with a crisis, there really is no bandwidth that people can use. So thinking collectively about what does it look like to build a pool of resources for local governments to share. We're starting a working group so that different leaders can share what's working and what isn't in their communities, so that the incredible research that's coming from many of you in this room, really can help people to kind of action it and understand what that looks like on the ground. Finding ways of having more access to experts on a regular basis. So the amount of information and the amount of research that's in this room is so inspiring, and I see it as a responsibility of local governments, but also of all of us, to think about how we can share it so that it can be best used on the ground.
Oh, sorry. Sure, I'll just hop in. Really appreciate that point in particular around welcoming conversation at the local level and making sure that it includes the unusual suspects. And I saw in the room Mitchell Beer with the energy mix saying thank you. So a plug for you and your panel tomorrow, because there's a really interesting project that's been happening to do just that and bring unusual voices into the conversation. Okay, so I have three points to add. You've already heard me pitch my first one, but I'm going to say it again because it's really, really important, and it's actually pretty difficult. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I think this is an apt analogy. We've heard that saying before: the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest trick the fossil fuel industry ever pulled was convincing us that they're not responsible for climate change. And everywhere we go and talk about climate change, the fossil fuel industry gets invisibilized, and it is up to us to constantly call them out as being responsible for climate change and being responsible for a lot of the dirty tricks that are behind delaying action on climate change. Second, we need global cooperation on this issue, because the folks who are propagating climate mis and disinformation are cooperating globally. They have a playbook. We see the same narratives that y'all gave examples of, or the same narratives that my international colleagues are telling me they're hearing in their communities in different parts of the world. There needs to be global cooperation to counter the global effort to convince people that climate change isn't real, isn't something that they have the ability to take action on, and isn't something that they should expect their governments to be taking action on. And then finally, we need civil society protections. So another part of this playbook, the mis and disinformation has goals. And one of the goals that it has is to reduce confidence in, reduce belief in civil society actors who have traditionally been there to tell the truth about what's going on when it comes to climate change, to push governments to take action on climate change, to call out the fossil fuel industry. And so consistently we see across the world that these mis and disinformation campaigns come along with campaigns to convince governments to shut down civil society rights and freedoms. And in some parts of the world, that actually means really harming people. In many parts of the world, it's life-threatening to be a climate activist. And so protecting the rights of civil society to engage in this issue as a counterforce to the anti-climate forces that are forcing this mis and disinformation down our throats is really critical. And I hope that's a message that we can also share with the Canadian government, because there's unfortunately a bit of a mixed history with the Canadian government in terms of civil society protections for environmental organizations.
Okay. We will now go to your questions. Sorry, I was enjoying our conversation very much. So we have a bunch of questions online. Do we have any questions in the room? We'll collect some questions at the very back as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So this is a question prompted by something that Nick said, but I invite the whole panel to answer if you'd like. And I found myself, nodding in agreement about this idea that Nick put forward about governments needing to think about how to earn people's trust. So the first question is, and I appreciate Nick started to touch on this, is how do they begin to do that? But more importantly, how do they avoid the charge of, political interference or politicizing the issue themselves, when some of the misinformation is actually coming from the political opposition, right? As an example, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation around the carbon tax coming from the political opposition. And so it almost became this self-fulfilling cycle. When governments tried to communicate about the carbon tax, and critics said this is just, ideological propaganda, aiming to build political support for this policy. And so how do you avoid this cycle of different sides of the political aisle pointing to each other? I'm thinking of that Spider-Man meme and saying, misinformation, misinformation. How do we deal with that? How do governments deal with that?
Okay, so we have how do we deal with political interference? And we have a question at the back as well.
Hello, thank you. I'm Leah Temper with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and we've been working on a campaign for the past 3.5 years or so called Fossil Fuel Ads Make Us Sick. So we worked on the greenwashing law, where we did have some success, but we've also been working for a tobacco-style ban on fossil fuel advertising. We had a bill at the national level, and we had some pushes also at the municipal level that pretty much failed miserably in Ottawa and in Toronto. And I think part of it was they were kind of saying, well, we're going to attack the disinformation. It was after the greenwashing law had come in, and they said, well, since this greenwashing law is here, we don't need to address, as you said, Kat, the elephant in the room, this systematic disinformation and deception from the fossil fuel industry. And could
you maybe get to the question?
Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead. So, the question is, and I'd love to hear your take, Zoe, and anyone else on the panel. Countries around the world are putting in place these bans. Cities around the world are doing it. Why here in Canada are we so loath to really first discuss sort of the cultural blockers that we have, discuss the power imbalances that we're going to face in this information space, and how do we overcome those? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Great question. Do we have questions online as well?
Yes, one question online, and it was sent anonymously, so we don't know the sender. I have a sense that even within institutions at an employee level, there are high degrees of distrust. What do you see as the responsibility of institutions, government or otherwise, to strengthen and build trust from within, including with and amongst their own staff, who in turn are part of the solution of cultivating broader institutional trust?
Okay, yeah, so what is the role and responsibility of institutions to strengthen and build trust? And did we have one more question in the room? I thought I saw another hand. Yeah, we do. Okay, we're going to collect that one last question, and then it's going to be rapid fire responses.
Thank you, everyone. So this is building on the conversations that was taking place this morning, and maybe it can sort of blend in with some of the other questions, but I'm really interested in this tension between the need to build trust in government as a purveyor of solutions and to counter this right-wing anti-government conspiracy space, while at the same time we are seeing an acceleration towards fascism in parts of the world, and also needing to really criticize bad policies and rollbacks and calling out, I work for environmental defense, I'm tracking lobbying and the way that the fossil fuel industry does have its claws in government. And so we want to be raising the profile of this issue. We want to be telling people about corporate capture in order to have them be distrusting of the fossil fuel industry, but at the same time, it does erode trust in government. And so I'm really interested in how we're both occupying the space where we're being really critical of the government's bad actions while also working to build trust. And I think it's great to hear, Nick's comment about government needing to demonstrate that it is competent. And I think doing good policy does help build trust, but at least from the perspective of somebody in the advocacy space, I'm curious about what folks' thoughts are about how advocates and external pressure groups can walk that line in a good way.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so all of these questions centered around trust, and it's like the role and responsibility of government. How do we address these tensions of differing narratives and differing responsibilities? Nick, I'm going to put you on the spot since you turned you are now on the screen. Would you like to jump in on any of these?
Yeah. So trust is the big issue. At the risk of repeating myself, I think a lot of this comes down to, like, the key word is earn trust. I think the golden rule with this whole trust issue is that you cannot reach into people's heads and just turn up a trust knob. And I think that's often how we talk about these issues as folks in civil society or institutions. So what are the levers that we can pull, or the ways that we can redesign our processes or communications or policymaking internally or externally, speaking to that other question about earning trust from within? I think we need to think about what changes we need to make in how we're behaving and communicating to bring about greater trust. That's step number one. It's like things aren't working. So what can we do? I think I'll try to just speak quickly to the issue of politicization and polarization. So first of all, I'm a humble public servant. So I think about this from a nonpartisan public service point of view, and not from the behaviors of politicians. I do think it reminded me of some really interesting empirical research by a researcher named Jay Van Bavel, who's great on the issues of mis and disinformation about climate and other topics and social media effects. Jay and colleagues have a paper arguing that basically polarization and politicization of issues that are inherently not actually political, like they're existential, has measurable public health effects. It harms people's health and well-being when we polarize and politicize these issues, or when they get polarized and politicized, I should say. And I think one key countermeasure or strategy that came to mind is, maybe this won't be satisfying, but I don't think the response to politicized mis and disinformation is to politicize it further from the other end. I think it's to our detriment when collective action problems, existential problems, get tethered in the optics space to one political party or another. And so I think any policies, any communications, any advocacy efforts, et cetera, that we do, I think we need to find a way to depoliticize aggressively and constantly and reframe these issues as they actually exist, which is at a level that transcends partisan politics. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Nick. Kat?
Yeah, thanks for the great questions. I'll just say a couple of points that kind of maybe brings together a few of them. I mean, when the UN Secretary General has called for a global ban on fossil fuel advertising, so shout out to Kate for doing that hard work along with other civil society actors here in Canada. The answer to why you haven't been met with success in the municipalities where you've done your greatest advocacy, I think, is probably related to the fossil fuel industry and the power that that industry has in Canada and the ways in which we desperately need to be unpacking that as a country. Just a reminder that the fossil fuel industry is responsible for over a third of Canadian emissions. To my fellow advocate in the room who was talking about, okay, like, what do we do about this? I think something I'm thinking about increasingly is that we've been kind of taking for granted for a while that everyone's just like on board with the idea of democracy. And I don't think that's quite true anymore. I think we've really lost track. What is democracy? I mean, actually a very healthy part of a functioning democracy that we can have trust in is critique. But we've lost track of that. We've gotten into this position where that dialogue, you know, the fact that we are active participants in our democracy, making choices, critiquing, having debates, and that is actually a healthy way for us as individuals and citizens to engaging with our governments, like, that common conception has really gone out the window. And a lot of that is, you know, I think we can talk for ages about why that is, but increasingly I think those of us who act on climate change need to also be thinking about how we act on defending democracy and restoring a common sense of shared values around democracy. And then finally, one of the major entry points, like if you think about the entry points that people have to like getting caught in the conspiracy loop around things like climate change, one of the major entry points is loneliness. And so when we're asking, like, what do we do about this? I think sometimes the answer is figuring out how to help people feel less alone. And those of us who are organizers, a big part of our job as organizers is to build community. And building community around some of these issues, I think, can help combat the loneliness that is that kind of vector for a lot of people to get caught up in these false narratives.
Great, thank you. I'm told we need to wrap up. So Zoe or Chris, if you want to say something, please be short and sweet.
I'd love to talk more about politicization, so find me in the lunch lineup. Just one very quick point on the trust for people who belong to institutions and how to cultivate that. One thing that we have been looking at a lot at our center is the issue of online harassment and abuse. And so one of our ongoing projects and advocacy is to make sure that different types of institutions treat that as an occupational health and safety issue and provide the kind of support programs in advance and that are accessible to people. We also know that that online and offline abuse can take different forms based on gender and racialization, can need different types of support. So developing the kind of wraparound support to embolden and encourage people to be able to speak who are at institutions is critical.
Okay, thanks. Zoe, anything?
I'll very briefly say from a local governance level, and to possibly answer all of these in a very short way, start early, start before you're even thinking about a motion going to table. We need to start building community and building trust yesterday, years before. Build trust around a shared vision of what the community and what our country can look like. We need to all be working towards that shared vision. That's where I think trust comes in, especially at a local level. And really prioritize the building of community, not the building necessarily of I say this as a communications professional, but the building of messaging and campaigns is incredibly important in the work that we all need to do, but so is building community, and so is thinking that the outcome of our work is relationships, not clicks.
Okay, thank you for excellent discussion, very thought-provoking. Sorry I kept everyone from lunch.
And thank you, Jennifer, Kat, Zoe, and Chris, and Nicholas for a fantastic conversation about governance. I'm really glad you hit governance at all levels, from the global, the new global initiative on information integrity and climate change. We're also going to be hearing more about that tomorrow and how our efforts can kind of fit into that global movement. But a reminder that our democracy really exists and is sometimes most vibrant at the local level, and that we need to invest in those relationships, in the vibrancy of the way in which we consult. That consultations are not a check mark. It's a way of developing a relationship, and underscoring all of that is trust and accountability. Those themes continue to come through in our discussions. Finally, I'm glad, Chris, you reminded us of the importance of the private sector as part of the governance discussion, not just the fossil fuel companies, but also the big tech companies. And I must admit, I've been remiss in my own public comments. I tend to talk less about regulation just because we've gotten so far away from being able to regulate tech companies that I don't even necessarily include that in my own. And it's a reminder that we have to continue that pressure that goes beyond the codes and the ethics and so forth. I must admit, one of the issues that I stress more, maybe we'll come back to this afternoon in the discussion around data, is the importance of data sovereignty for Canada as a governance challenge. I just put that out because maybe that's something that we can explore more this afternoon. So I hope that you continue this spirit of dialogue over the lunch period. So there is lunch available at the back of the room. I would encourage you, in fact, request that you be back at 1:20 so that we can continue our structured dialogue around these different themes. And thanks again for this wonderful discussion on governance. And thanks to you for bringing forward your ideas and questions.
Thank you.